travellers who are infected has declined, and the incidence of COVID-19 infections in our community has massively increased, as we had to expect. So given the rapid change in risks posed, we believe it's now appropriate to drop the requirement for self-isolation of fully vaccinated travellers after they arrive in New Zealand. This could apply both to returning New Zealanders and to tourists when borders are open more generally. We do recommend that arriving travellers should be tested, either at the airport or within 24 hours of arrival. Those who return a positive test should be managed in the same way as people in New Zealand who become infected with this virus. We recommend that whole genome sequencing should be carried out in those cases as a surveillance tool to detect the arrival of new variants of the virus. I think it's important for us all to remember that this pandemic is not over, or nearly over. The virus continues to mutate, and personally, I'll be surprised if we're still talking about the Omicron variant by the end of the year. And Prime Minister, I think people have a copy of our report, and I'll be happy to answer any questions later.
Thank you, Professor Skegg. As a result of the advice that Professor Skegg has spoken to briefly this afternoon, I can announce today Cabinet has agreed that from 11:59 p.m. Wednesday the 2nd of March, vaccinated travellers entering New Zealand will no longer need to self-isolate. That means from this Wednesday, Kiwis and eligible travellers arriving from Australia will no longer need to self-isolate for 7 days. In making this decision, we have carefully balanced other factors. The first is that our borders are still gradually opening. Our staged reopening remains, which will help stagger the impact on our current outbreak, and I'll speak to that in a moment. The second is that testing will remain critical, as Professor Skegg has set out. And so we will still require every traveller to undertake a rapid antigen test on the day they arrive and on day 5, 6. All positive rats must be registered and followed up with a PCR test. This is different to the advice for those currently in the community who test positive with a rapid antigen test, who don't need a PCR follow-up. And that's because our border will be the first place we'll see any new variants. And so we need to keep whole genome sequencing these results so we know what strains of the virus are entering the country. All incoming travellers, of course, will also still be required to undertake a pre-departure test before they get on a plane. Our managed isolation facilities will remain in place for some. All unvaccinated travellers will still need to enter MIQ. We have, though, asked for advice on whether this requirement needs to remain going forward in the future. And while we still face a global pandemic, MIQ is a useful tool for us to have available, even if it is not used at the scale we have seen in the past. And finally, to the question of phasing of our border reopening. You'll remember that we set out 5 steps for travellers coming to New Zealand between the end of February and October. The first group is New Zealanders coming from Australia, which started today. The second group, Step 2, is made up of returning Kiwis and eligible critical workers from the rest of the world and was scheduled to start from the 13th of March. Today I can confirm that New Zealanders in Step 2 will now be able to arrive from 11:59 p.m. this Friday, March 4. And in line with today's decision, will not need to self-isolate. Due to immigration processes, other non-New Zealanders who are part of Step 2, such as working holiday visa holders and RSC workers, will still be eligible to arrive from the 13th, but will not, as I say, have to isolate. Now, as for the remaining steps, which include holders in April, Australians and visitors from visa waiver countries by July, and all others from October, Cabinet will shortly consider bringing these steps forward. The advice from our experts is that getting over the peak of Omicron should be factored into this timing and those decisions. But as a result of the decision taken today, I can assure you now that as we open, All vaccinated travellers who test negative on arrival with a rapid antigen test will be able to immediately enjoy New Zealand and all it has to offer and not have to self-isolate. I know this will be welcome news to the members of our team overseas, eager to travel home to see loved ones as soon as possible. We can't wait to see you. It's also a huge milestone for our tourism sector and regional economies. New Zealand has achieved so much over the last few years. Our successful elimination of COVID saved lives. Our economy is delivering record low unemployment and growth higher than many. And our high rate of vaccination means we can make decisions like today's, knowing we have a strong blanket of protection against the virus. And as I've said many times through this pandemic, New Zealand has and will continue to forge our own path and strategy. But caution has served us well. As we continue to move through the Omicron outbreak and peak, we will continue to remove restrictions when advised it is safe to do so. And today, that is what we have been told, and so that is what we are doing. We're now both happy to take questions. I will just take up front COVID-related questions, and then for other items we'll take them after so that we can release Professor Skegg from the podium, as it were. Yeah, Jason.
Could you give us even some sort of indication as to when the changes around the tourism phase might come in? Can we expect an announcement before the summer period in the Northern Hemisphere, for example?
Yeah, look, we'll be looking to make sure that we give make those decisions in a timely way so that planning can be undertaken. We know that's critical for our tourism sector, it's critical for our airlines. But the early feedback, and again, we want this to be more formal, but the early feedback from our experts is, look, we are still in the middle of this peak. We are still waiting to reach the peak. At the moment, welcoming home New Zealanders will have a minimal impact, but we do want to be careful about tens of thousands of travellers in a week right when we're managing this part of the outbreak. But Professor Skegg, I'm aware that you've not formally met to discuss this advice, but perhaps you might have some views on that as well.
Well, thank you, Prime Minister. Yes, I think it is sensible for us to be quite cautious at the moment because we haven't reached the peak. The next few weeks are going to be very challenging for New Zealand. We don't know exactly how things will pan out. So we certainly wouldn't want tens of thousands of people coming in at the moment. But obviously, I think later in the year, there will be the opportunity to welcome tourists, hopefully more quickly than we envisaged. And that will partly be a matter of safeguarding health. And also, of course, there are all sorts of economic issues as well.
And just a quick follow-up for Dr. Skegg. You said that it would be unlikely that at the end of this year that we'd be talking about the Omicron variant. Is that because you think that there is another variant that could become more prevalent?
Yes, of course there are already several variants of Omicron, and the virus is replicating massively around the world, so we must expect that more variants will arise. They'll only displace Omicron if they're more transmissible than Omicron is, and Omicron's pretty infectious. But, I mean, the view of most experts in evolutionary virology, and that's not my field, do expect that new variants will arise this year, and any one that displaces Omicron could be more or less virulent. So we just need to maintain that caution. It could be that we're facing later in the year a new threat. We hope not. We hope that any new variant will be less virulent than Omicron and we'll be able to consign this to history.
And that's why, just to close it off, yes, the evidence suggests now we can safely make these alterations to our border, but we are also looking to enhance the surveillance we have at our border as well. So that's where that whole genome sequencing of all positive cases, we are exploring our ability to have closer proximity of testing that allows PCR at our border. We are looking at that, and we will continue to maintain an MIQ network of sorts. These are measures that sensibly need to be in place as we continue our journey through this pandemic. Jessica, then Jenna. and then I'll come into the front with Thomas.
Omicron's set to peak in New Zealand in mid-March under the updated modelling. So how long after we've peaked, let's say the next 5 weeks are bumpy, how long after that would you be prepared to open our border to non-New Zealanders?
What we are expecting is it's likely that Auckland will peak first and give us a signal as to what we can expect for the rest of the country. But things are tracking more rapidly than modellers first anticipated. So we're looking at perhaps as early as mid-March, as you say, possibly even a touch earlier for that peak to be reached. Looking then as to what that then allows us to do in terms of other decision making, we've already said that once we have come through the peak, we're coming down the other side. We've seen our hospitalisations become more regular. We've seen that our health system is on a more stable footing. That will enable us to make further changes to our restrictions, but also continue to consider the opening up of our border.
Should you have done this a couple of days ago? If you'd asked for Professor Skegg's advice, should we have had this in place already?
So you'll have seen that we've moved very quickly, considering, of course, that we always said when we reach a point where our cases are at a point where incoming cases from New Zealanders arriving will have less material impact, that's when we'll be ready to move. We moved to that place within the space of essentially 6 or 7 days. In that space, we received the advice that the timing was right. It came through on Sunday, Cabinet considered on Monday, and it will be enacted on Wednesday.
That advice earlier though?
We would have been had to therefore anticipate. We would have been asking our experts to project forward without actually having the situation in front of us. So, I think what this demonstrates is every time we have seen a significant change in the pandemic, we're moving very rapidly to safely adjust what we do at the same time.
A couple of plane loads of Kiwis have landed in New Zealand from Australia already.
And I welcome them.
Do they have to do the full week?
No, they don't. So they will not. You're right, we expect several thousand over the course of this week. There'll be at best potentially a few thousand who may need to isolate for 48 hours. But no, beyond 11:59 on Wednesday, no one will be required to self-isolate any further.
Did you actually need expert advice to tell you that the risk at the border is not as high as it once was now that we have tens of thousands of cases in the community?
The thing that has gotten us through this pandemic has been our desire to integrate the best possible advice from our public health experts, our infectious disease specialist and our epidemiologist. Yes, we're experiencing Omicron now, but that will not be the last variant we experience. We want to make sure that as we change our settings at the border, we do it in a really careful and well-managed way. So it was important to us to get the most up-to-date advice before making that decision. Professor, is there anything you wanted to add on that?
Well, I would just...
they're essentially asking whether or not your advice was necessary. You might have a view on that.
Well, no, I shouldn't give an opinion on that. But all I can say is, if you had asked for our advice 2 or 3 weeks ago, we would probably have given a different answer. So, this has developed very rapidly. And you'll see in the report that one of our members was actually thinking we should wait a little bit longer. So I don't think this is something that could have been entertained a month ago.
Jessica, the conversation to commission the advice was Wednesday. So actually we did ask. We've just got to give the group time to then give the advice.
The numbers went up though on that Monday. So if it had been commissioned straight away, I'm just thinking before the weekend and before this first lot of Aussies came through.
Well, I guess the point that Professor Skegg is making is if you'd asked us too early, we would have got different advice.
The possibility of MIQ returning for a future variant, is that still on the table?
Sorry, what was that?
Is this the end of isolation for incoming travellers? Or
we will retain MIQ, and we will have to work through how we do that in such a way that allows us to scale it up should we need to, but have some capacity available. And look, there's a range of reasons why immediately it is still useful to us, but in the future as well, as Professor Skegg has said, we can't make an assumption that any future variant will be less severe than this one. And if there is a variant that is to overtake Omicron, it would need to be more transmissible and it may well be more severe, but we'll let Professor Skegg speak to that.
Yes, well, that summarises it well, Prime Minister.
How do you imagine keeping the MIQ? I mean, will you just keep some hotels on the government books? Like, are you going to carve it?
Yeah, we're working through some of the advice on the nature of that network, but what we've considered to date is the possibility of having some facilities which we may have used already, which may become part of our permanent network, versus whether or not we have lease arrangements as well. So we're working to finalise what that will look like. But keeping in mind, of course, we're moving our MIQ systems quite quickly here.
Those that are in MIQ at the moment be let out?
Yes, they will. Yep. So today there are 150 people that are immediately eligible for self-isolation, of course, and they'll only need to do that through till midnight Wednesday. So yes, those individuals are released from today.
And the ones that will come in over the course of the week will be let free on Friday?
Yes, correct. Absolutely correct.
Does this mark the end of self-isolation? Like, are you not going back to the way you've moved on from lockdowns? Have you now moved on from border restrictions?
Usual caveats. Here we are making these decisions in light of the experience we're having and the evidence we have. But I think every expert would want us to just remind people that this pandemic isn't over yet. So we need to make sure that we still have in our back pocket all of the tools that have got us through so far. That doesn't mean we shouldn't celebrate this milestone today.
I also ask, across the road is obviously the protest. It will enter its 4th week tomorrow. It's an international beacon for the anti-vaccine movement. Do you have a plan to stop people coming from Australia and further abroad to protest outside Parliament?
Well, of course, those individuals, we of course do not predetermine where people will go after they arrive in the country. Keeping in mind though, of course, if you're unvaccinated, you're still required to go into MIQ. Yep.
The report
Yes.
The report talks about the possibility of requiring 3 doses of an approved vaccine to be qualified as fully vaccinated.
Yep.
Has the government given any thought to that and when it might consider it? And Professor Skegg, do you have a view on when New Zealand might need to take that approach of calling 3 doses as fully?
So we have given, we haven't made any final decisions on that. I think one of the things that we've been considering is we have to operationalise any decision that we take in this area, and of course we have to factor in the availability of boosters at the point of departure, and of course making sure that we are fair and reasonable in assessing whether or not someone's had the opportunity to be boosted from the last second dose that they've had to operationalise, but we have given it consideration and we haven't taken a final view. Professor
Yeah, thank you. And Prime Minister, we didn't recommend that. We just noted that it's something that needs to be considered in the future. And I guess today, all I'd be saying is I would really encourage all New Zealanders over 18 to get their booster if they haven't had it already.
Yeah. Absolutely, and we are seeing the impact of boosters right now. You know, you look at our hospitalisations. There is no question boosters are making a difference in New Zealand. No question. At all. Claire.
On the court decision on the mandates, has the government given...
Do you mind if I just wrap up with questions and then I'm... Other questions that involve... in the future of our pandemic management, because
for this Omicron outbreak when I wouldn't want to be too pessimistic about this. I think we are in a very good position, but there still are about 30% of people, or a bit less I think,